Hello, everyone. My name is April Hanna, and I am the host of the Path 11 podcast and also the producer of Path 11 Productions and Path 11 TV. And today we are coming to you live on Facebook for about an hour. And I am hoping to have some interaction with all of you. You can put some comments in the chat. But I am here and joined today with the founder of the Afterlife Awareness Conference, Terry Daniel, and grief guide, Brian Smith. So we are going to have a nice discussion to talk to you a little bit about the Afterlife Conference that is happening June 24th through the 27th. That is coming up. And we are also going to have conversations about death, the afterlife, and anything else that you'd like to talk about. So I'd like to first introduce you to Dr. Terry Daniel. This is a woman who has come into my life back in 2018. She has greatly changed it for the better. I have learned so much from her being behind the scenes of the Afterlife Conference. It has helped me tremendously with my own grieving processes. It helped me to be a better therapist with all that I've learned about grief, bereavement, the dying process, shamanic practices, everything. This Afterlife Conference is phenomenal. But let me tell you a little bit more about her. So Dr. Terry Daniel is an interfaith clinical chaplain, trauma specialist, and end-of-life educator, certified in death, dying, and bereavement by the Association of Death Education and Counseling, and in trauma support by the International Association of Trauma Professionals. Her work focuses on assisting dying and grieving individuals to discover a more spiritually spacious understanding of death and beyond. She conducts workshops throughout the US, and she's been doing a lot of stuff online since the pandemic, and is really helping people and the bereaved to find healing through meditative, ritual, and therapeutic processes that focus on inner transformation rather than external events. She's written a number of different books, and her interest really started at the age of 12 when she began having mystical experiences. But it wasn't really until the death of her 16-year-old son in 2006 that she really immersed herself in studying multicultural religious traditions and metaphysical practices that help the dying and the living find healing through meditative and ritual processes. So the list goes on of all the things that this wonderful woman has done. But Terry Daniel, welcome.
Gosh, April, what an introduction. I don't even know what to say. Thank you. It's so much fun to be here, and it's so nice to work with you. And I love you, and I love Mike, and I love Path 11 Productions. For those of you who don't know, Path 11's been doing the live stream for the last 3 conferences. Will this be the 4th?
Yeah, this is going to be the 4th.
This will be the 4th. And they've traveled to Florida and Salt Lake City and all over the place with us. And then there was COVID. So we've been doing everything online, and they do the magic behind the curtain. They're the man behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz. I have no idea what they do, but because of them, we are here doing this.
Yes, and we love it. We've had so much fun. Like I said, we've learned so much. And so this year is really interesting because it's the 11th year of your conference. You know, the 10th year, the big shebang that we were going to have last year kind of got shut down with COVID. We had to scramble, cancel things, bring it online for a virtual conference. And you decided, hey, this worked out really well. Let's do it again for this year, for the 11th year. But this is really the last year that the conference is going to look like this, because you're beginning to switch the focus for next year into something different. But let's talk about the conference this year first, and it being one of the last, of how you're really going to organize it, and the people that you're going to bring together is going to look a little bit different. So what do we have on deck for this year's Afterlife Conference?
So I'm referring to this as the classic Afterlife Conference, and then the different one that we're starting in 2022, which we'll talk about later. I'm calling that Afterlife Conference 2.0. So this year, this is our 11th conference, and really it's been 12 years for me, because that's when I started planning it. We have been all these years, bringing in the greatest minds in afterlife research, near-death experience, mediumship, meditation, out-of-body journeying. These are names that if you've been following this field at all, you know who these people are. Anita Moorjani, Eben Alexander, Raymond Moody, Annie Kagan, William Bullman from the Monroe Institute. The list goes on and on. We've had the most amazing people over the last 11 years, and I love them and thank them. And this year, because we're online again, it's going to be smaller than the big live conferences used to be. But again, we have amazing people. I don't have the list right in front of me right now, so I'm going to have to actually look at the website to give you all their names. But off the top of my head, of course, I'll start out with our mediums. We have Suzanne Northrup, of course, who is our medium in residence, who's been with us every year, and Thomas John, who also has been with us several times at the conference. So they're going to be doing audience readings on Friday and Sunday. We have our shamans, of course, which has become a regular part of the conference in the last several years. And that includes Linda Fitch and Austin Wells, Jana Din, who is a shaman who works in a clinical setting in ICU and emergency rooms and hospitals, which is incredible that that even happens. And with her partner, David Steinhorn, who's a pediatrician and medical school professor, the two of them bring shamanic practices into actual hospitals and medical clinics. And while we're talking about shamans and medicine, of course, we have my beloved friend, Jeff Black, who is a MD. He's a psychiatrist and a chaplain and a practicing shaman. And along with him comes Kitty Edwards, also a shamanic practitioner who teaches conscious dying and a whole process of literally the dying process, how the consciousness separates from the body in the act of dying. And boy, I'm doing a good job of segueing all this. And speaking of dying, we have for the second time Ken Doka, who is the senior consultant for the Hospice Foundation of America. And he's going to be talking about his new book on the extraordinary experiences of the dying, of all of it, and the grieving, deathbed visions, after-death communication, mediumship, all of that. Now, Ken is really interesting because I've known him for many years, and he never used to really be into the metaphysics of all this. But over the years, as he's looked at the research, because there's been a lot of research, done in bona fide academic settings, he has now been convinced that this is real, that these extraordinary experiences really happen. And he actually asked me to write the foreword for his new book, which I'm thrilled about. Let's see, who else have we got? We've got the wonderful Brian Smith, who will be talking to you here in a minute, talking about grieving people working with mediums. Does that help? How does it help? And how often should you do it? Should you do it at all? And Phil Borges, also back for the second time. This guy is an amazing filmmaker. He travels all over the world, and he does documentaries about people in indigenous cultures everywhere, Tibet, Africa, South America, and how they approach what we would consider in this culture to be mental illness. They look at it as what they call shaman sickness. And a person who is hearing voices and behaving oddly and, having all these, what we would consider symptoms, is actually connected to other dimensions and interacting interdimensionally. And of course, that doesn't fit in this world very well. And so he has studied how other cultures address this. So that's very interesting. We got some workshops. Patty Pellerito, who is does sound healing with gongs and bowls and bells, and Jocelyn Obermeyer, who does music to accompany the dying for hospices. She's a music thanatologist. And Austin Wells is doing a workshop. Also, our keynote this year is Robert Thurman, who is the leading scholar on Buddhism in the West. I can't remember, April, we interviewed him, and he has a title. He's called something like the Dalai Lama's Man in the West or something like that. What was it? I don't remember that title, but he's brilliant, and he's going to be talking about how to die like a Tibetan Buddhist. So our audience is very interested in, the afterlife, but they're also interested in the end of life and the actual process of dying and everything that happens in life, such as loss and trauma and, of course, grief.
Yeah. And I just love how comprehensive it is. It's not just a conference just based all on, I guess, educational stuff where it's just like the people that are writing the books here, you combined, the shamans that come in, the people in the clinical setting. You also have bereaved parents, that are presenters. So it's really just so comprehensive. And also, the traditions that we did with the closing ceremonies and the opening ceremonies that you have are just really beautiful to touch on all aspects of death, and also bringing in the spirituality piece, and to have mediums at a conference like this. So, and I'm really, really interested to bring Brian on, Brian Smith, who is a grief guide. And he also has a podcast. I was also recently a guest on his podcast, Grief to Growth. So thanks, Brian, for having me there. It was a really great conversation that we had as we kind of talked about my own personal grief journey. But I thought that this is a really great topic in really trying to figure out, can mediumship help or hurt people? And a lot of people that I have also seen in my own clinical practice, when they are going through the loss of a loved one, some people are very open to wanting to meet with mediums and to try to connect with their loved ones on the other side. And I've also have had some clients that have had some sessions with mediums where it was not helpful. Like I remember one client, he had just lost his wife of like 50 years. I mean, they were together for a really long time. And the medium had said to him, your wife says it's okay to move on. And he was so in the throes of grief. I mean, maybe a month into it. And he was like, that was the worst thing that I could have heard. I don't want to move on. This is the love of my life, and it really caused even more grief on top of it, where he was just so disturbed by what he had heard. But then you also have experiences where mediums can bring such closure and comfort, and can really be a very pivotal point of the grieving process for people. So, Brian, welcome to our Facebook Live today. And maybe before we get into that topic, can you just give our viewers who are watching a little more background about your story and what brought you into working at the Afterlife Conference and speaking about grief?
Sure. Well, just really quickly, my story starts I'm used to have my daughter over my shoulder. She's usually my background, but it starts with the passing of my 15-year-old daughter 6 years ago. It'll be 6 years ago in a couple of weeks. My daughter Shayna passed from this life into spirit. She was 15 years old. And I, interestingly enough, my journey is kind of similar to Terry's. I didn't have mystical experiences as a teenager, but I had an intense fear of death. It's known as thanatophobia. And I completely feared death, dying at any moment. It was brought about largely by toxic religion, which Terry and I've talked about a lot. And so I've had this fear like most of my life. Long story short, when my daughter passed away a few years ago, I had to know what had happened to her. Where had she gone? What was she doing? Could we still have a relationship? All those questions. So that led me through a series of events, and that's how I ended up meeting Terry. And Terry and I worked together. I can't remember how many times now. We've taught together for various things. I've spoken at our conference. So I've learned a lot about the afterlife. I'm also part of Helping Parents Heal, which is an organization for parents whose children have transitioned. And I've been part of that organization for about 5 years now. And so I've got to talk to a lot of parents. And I've been fortunate to meet with some of the best mediums in the world, literally. Thomas John's going to be speaking at the conference. I know Thomas, pretty well, and several other mediums I've gotten to work with. So it's really been interesting to me because I was not at all interested in mediumship, knew nothing about it until my daughter made her transition. And when something like that happens, it kind of opens you up to this new thing that people think may be fraudulent. So as you guys were saying, it can be very helpful. Like a session with the medium can be worth years of traditional grief counseling, or it can be devastating. A medium could say something really terrible. I always say that there are mediums, there are good mediums, bad mediums, mediums, and there are frauds. There are people that are just downright frauds. So going to see a medium that is a fraud or that tries to rip you off can be extremely devastating to people. It can actually set people back on the grief journey. So it's really important to get references when you're going to see a medium. And I'll be talking about this at the conference. Like, what are the things you should look for in a medium? How do you know whether they're real or not? How should you set up a reading? How often should you have a reading? Can you get addicted to mediumship? Because sometimes people do. So these are all things to consider if you're going to think about going down this path. The other thing is, and I just saw this literally this morning, someone's asking, my church doesn't believe in mediums. The Bible says I shouldn't consult mediums. So it can be complicated by religious beliefs and religious restrictions. So what does the Bible really say about that? Or what, should we consult with the dead? Those are questions that can keep people tied up for a very long time. So those are some of the things I'll be talking about at the conference.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really good point that you bring up. And Terry, I think you're kind of an expert on this about how toxic sometimes religion can be for people and how it can actually hurt the grieving process. So I'll let you step in there because I know that is
I really want to step in because what you said, that story about someone went to a medium a month after the wife died, and the medium said, "Your wife says it's okay to move on." This is one of my biggest peeves about mediums because I am trained as a grief counselor and have, spent 10 years in school getting this education and internships and all of the stuff that I've done. I have studied grief theory. I've read the research. I know how to do counseling. And what that medium said was so wrong and so terrible. And if that medium had even the tiniest little bit of education in grief theory and grief counseling, they would never say that, because a person who's a month out is not even thinking about moving on.
Exactly.
You just don't say that. And this is, so many mediums, the really good mediums that I know have actually studied grief and understand counseling. Well, you understand this, April, counseling procedure and counseling technique. The good mediums realize that they're dealing with a really vulnerable person in such a fragile situation. And, and that's not even evidential reading, by the way, and Brian, I want you to talk more about this, but I could, anybody could fake a reading like that.
Yeah.
And I have seen fake mediums, look out at an audience full of people who are older. They're all gray heads in the seats. They're all over 50, and they'll find somebody who's, in their 60s and say, "Do you have a parent on the other side?"
Yeah. It's one of my favorites.
Of course they have a parent on the other side. Well, your mom says she loves you. I could do that. I could totally fake that. I'm not a medium. I can say to any person anywhere who has a dead person somewhere, "Oh, your mom came to me and she told me to say she loves you and you were really a good son." That's not mediumship.
Right.
Go ahead, Brian.
I completely agree. And I want to echo something you said, Terry, earlier about mediums, because you might even be really talented as a medium, as connecting with people on the other side, but you have to know how to talk to people and what to say and what not to say and how to filter those messages. So I know people that are naturally talented as mediums, but they still need to take training. Unfortunately, there's not, and at least in the US, I don't think there's any professional organizations that mediums have to go through. And anybody can hang out the shingle and say I'm a medium and say some very, very harmful things to people. So it's a case of caveat emptor. The buyer has to beware. We've got to be aware when we go see these people that are calling themselves mediums, and understand how to deal, those fake readings, and learn what a cold reading is and what a hot reading is, because these are things we need to do to protect ourselves when we're going to see people that might prey on the vulnerable. And that's one of the things. That's one of the big knocks on mediumship is they're grief vampires. They're just preying on people that are in grief and will believe anything, which is absolutely not true. Mediumship is definitely real and it can be very, very helpful, but we have to be very careful.
And that brings us to the question of getting addicted to readings, because, I think we have all heard, there was a famous story about a guy who had spent something like $10,000 on mediumship readings. It was a famous story. I don't remember the details, but tell us, Brian, how does that happen? And why would a good medium allow that? Which of course they wouldn't.
Well, yeah, you just said the right thing there. A good medium wouldn't allow that. The mediums I know, the professionals, will not allow you to keep coming back to them over and over again, and they'll set limits and they'll look for those addictions. Now, early on, you might want to get 2 or 3 readings, right up front, but then they'll start to say, you can't come to me all the time, because most of the mediums that I work with, and all the mediums I work with are fantastic, by the way, but they will tell you, you can make this connection yourself. I'm here kind of as a crutch to just let you know your loved one is there for you, but let me teach you how to do this yourself. Most of the mediums I know, they teach mediumship. They're literally trying to put themselves out of business. So yes, we have to, as people that are bereaved, we still have to be cautious, and we need to, limit the amount of readings that we're getting, and not just running from medium to medium, trying to hear different things, because some people will take all of your money and leave you with nothing.
And you're not going to hear different things. You're going to hear, the same things over and over again.
Now, I have to say one thing that's really cool, because of the work I do get to get a lot of readings with mediums for test purposes, etc. It's really cool when one medium tells you something that's unique, and then another medium tells you the same things like two or 3 weeks later. That is amazing. That's happened to me, where people, totally unrelated mediums, don't know anything about each other, and they'll give me the same message.
Yeah. And Brian, I'm curious to know too, after your daughter had passed, how did the mediums that you went to, how did that help your grief?
The biggest way I think mediumship help is just validation. As much as we study and as much as we are told that there's an afterlife, until we can kind of see it for ourselves, it's kind of hard to believe it until we can personalize. So reading NDE stories helps me a lot. That helped me a lot. But when a medium can tell you that your daughter says she saw you have that birthday cake yesterday, that lets me know that, not only is my daughter okay, she's still here with me. She's still aware of what's going on in my life. So it just totally lifts your spirit, and it changes your connection with that person on the other side. Because again, if that medium can have a connection with the other person on the other side, then maybe I can have a connection too. Maybe they're not really gone. Maybe they're not far away. Even if you do believe in, quote, heaven, maybe they're still right here. So I've seen it really just lift people's spirits just entirely by just validating that belief that we all want to have.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And I also want to encourage those who are watching and listening, if you do have any questions, any comments, if you have any experiences that you'd like to share about readings that you've received, feel free to go ahead and put something in the comments there. We will have the ability to read them and answer any questions. But Terry, I wanted to kind of come back to you. When Brian had mentioned that sometimes people may have a conflict within their own religion, that they're not supposed to seek out mediums, that this is not okay, that this is against what is being taught in their church or their religion. This also segues a little bit into how you're going to change the conference a little bit and begin to bring this subject area to more light and have it become more of the bread and butter of the Afterlife conference for next year. So what would you like to say about this?
I have a lot to say about that, but I want to put a bookmark in that for just a minute and just say something more about what Brian was saying before we move off of that topic. And it actually fits. I have been engaging recently with a lot of people in different podcasts and different groups and academic circles who really don't have a firm belief in the afterlife and in mediumship. They're questioning, or they identify as atheists. They don't believe in anything in the non-physical world. And I've been trying to I spoke at a conference a couple weeks ago called the Conference on Religious Trauma. And I was pretty much the only person among the speakers there, and probably the audience, who believes that there is a spiritual dimension beyond just the scientific physical world. And so I kind of struggled with how I was going to present that to them, and it worked out fine. But I've been thinking about how to put it into words in a way that wouldn't offend a religious person and wouldn't offend a completely non-spiritual person. And I came up with something like this. That's like, Well, statistically, I think it was not the Pew Research, the Gallup poll, something like 75% of people believe in an afterlife. So if we say it like, if we believe that consciousness can exist outside of the body, to a place where we go to in dreams and meditations and near-death experience, if consciousness can exist outside the body, when you die, it's in another dimension. And that consciousness was previously embodied in this body of a person, say, Marilyn Smith of Hoboken, New Jersey, and it was in that body as Marilyn Smith. And now it's the consciousness is outside the body. That consciousness is still somewhere in another dimension. And if it's there, it doesn't seem to me that there's any reason why we can't locate that consciousness and engage and interact with it. If you put it in those kind of terms, if you strip away the spiritual language and the religious language, and we don't say heaven and we don't say afterlife, I mean, these are all fine words, but once we use them, it immediately throws up a block for a lot of people. So I'm really striving to find language that's as neutral as possible so that people on the science end and people on the religious end can both understand it. Another interesting thing about that is, even religious people, let me back up on that. Religious people believe in an afterlife. The whole reason religion was even formulated or created at all in human history is to address death. Because, primitive people, had the question like, why did the baby die? Why did the crops not grow? And so you create theology and you create gods and mythologies to answer those questions because we want to make meaning out of everything. So religion exists because of questions about death. And most people in most religions believe that there is an afterlife of some kind, so that consciousness goes somewhere in another dimension. But they draw the line at believing it's okay to talk to that consciousness, and that makes no sense. I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day who said, oh, I believe that we can talk to the dead, but they can't talk to us. Why not? Why is there such a big belief in an afterlife, but the taboo comes and slams itself down on believing that there can be a two-way conversation? And there's actually, biblical reasons for that. Brian could probably quote scripture on that better than I can. But in the Old Testament, we actually have a very important biblical figure who did go to a medium to make contact with someone important to him. But then when it also says in Deuteronomy, also in the Old Testament, that talking to seers and worshiping the stars and doing all this is an abomination to God. So, if we're going to start talking Bible, we can spend years going back and forth over all the contradictions. But so that was just my response to what you said. Brian, you look like you want to say something.
Well, when it comes to the religious thing and the restrictions on talking to the dead, as you said, Terry, it's really interesting. We are all spirits or consciousness, to put it in non-religious terms. And we communicate with each other all the time. Right now, we're having a conversation. The three of us, we're three consciousness having a conversation. But when one of us leaves the body, suddenly it's forbidden to communicate with that consciousness anymore. That really makes no sense. And that is a power thing put on by certain religious people to say, you have to come through me. And it's interesting, the story you told about Saul and the witch of Endor. The Bible doesn't say that the medium wasn't real. She was very real. And he did connect with the person he wanted to connect to. But it was just restricted because you were supposed to go through the priest. Daniel in the Bible, or not Daniel, Joseph was a dreamer. Yeah. And he would have these dreams, these prophetic dreams. He would interpret people's dreams. It still goes on today. I talked to a client on Saturday that has dreams like that. But her church won't accept it. They'll read the Bible and they'll say, oh, Joseph was a great guy, but you dreamt that your loved one was going to be killed and you knew exactly how it was going to happen. That's of the devil. So that's how religion tries to, and religious actually means to bind. That's how it tries to bind us sometimes. So the other thing I want to say about mediumship and religion, I know a couple of mediums, that are very devout Christians, and they have struggled with their gift because of the restrictions put on them by their church, and they have studied the Bible and they have prayed, and they have come to the conclusion that their gift brings people peace and hope and joy. So they go forward and they still declare themselves to be Christians, and they do their work. So it's not against Christianity. And anybody that has any questions about that, I would love to talk to you about it.
Beautiful. That's awesome, Brian. That's exactly right. And it's interesting that you said binding. I've heard Christians describe themselves as bond servants to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, really? You're a slave?
Yeah.
God, that's the theology? And it really is the theology, a slave, a sheep.
But Jesus said we're sons.
Yes. And so there's a segue to what we're going to do with the next conference. So for people who are tuning in late, I don't know how Facebook Live works, but I guess, can they go back and listen to what we talked about before this? All right. So go back and listen where we're talking about this year's conference, because in 2022, we're going to do something very different. So if any of you guys are familiar with me and my work, you'll know that I'm trained as a theologian, basically, and my research is on toxic theology, and particularly the effect that it has on the grief process. Because like Brian, I've had a lot of clients and hundreds of people who've come to me through the Afterlife conference who are grieving, who find that their religious beliefs, even if they don't embrace those beliefs anymore, but it's still ingrained, it's called embedded theology, is complicating their grief process. So if you have a loved one who died by suicide, even though in your more evolved state where you are today, all your life you've been told that suicides go to hell, and now that your loved one has died by suicide, you're grappling with that. It's in there somewhere. And, it's hard enough going through the grief over that person being gone without having to complicate it with that. It's especially hard for children who are grieving, because the burden of having lost a parent or a sibling is so huge, and children have so much of that theology floating around in their head. Things like, well, we prayed and prayed and prayed for him to get better, but he died. Why didn't God listen? And that's like something a 7-year-old would ask. Mm-hmm. But there are plenty of 70-year-olds asking the same question. So over these last 6 or 7 years, I have been trained and have worked professionally as a hospice chaplain. I have encountered this daily with people depending on the theology they learned as children to support them through a trauma they're experiencing as an adult. And I did my doctoral dissertation on this, and so it's really important to me. It's also important to the culture at large, because if you look at the statistics and the research now, all of America is moving away from traditional religion. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but I will at our next conference, and I'll give them to you. Huge shift away from identifying with a religion or a denomination, huge shift away from going to church. Yet people are still keeping their spirituality. They just don't want that bonded package. And some people are throwing away spirituality altogether. So that's what I'm changing the conference to next year. That's what we're going to focus on. And it's not going to be called the Afterlife Conference anymore. It's going to be the Conference on Death, Grief, and Belief. So we're still going to talk about death and grief, but we're going to look at it all through the lens of belief systems. And that doesn't have to necessarily be a religious belief. It can be a cultural belief or a family belief. So it's going to be very different. Why did I decide to change it? Because 11 years, I've basically been having the same conference, and I feel like I've gone as far as I can go with that. We've covered every leading teacher in this field. As I mentioned earlier, we've had all the greats, Raymond Moody, Eben Alexander, all the big best-selling authors, Anita Moorjani, all of those. We've done all of that. And two things are happening. We can't keep bringing those same people back over and over again, because they're sort of waning in popularity too, because the culture shifts. Everybody moves and evolves. And I think when I say us, I mean the group, our followers, the people in this community that we work with the Afterlife Conference, we're kind of moving on. We're like, okay, we know near-death experience is real. We've read 10,000 reports of near-death experiences. We know about afterlife. We know about all this. What else you got? Give us something new. And so I think that exploring the theologies that we bring to the table is going to be the something new. And that's what the new Afterlife conferences will be. We're not going to have any mediums anymore. I feel kind of done with that. I have seen hundreds and hundreds of mediumship readings, have most of our community. And you can find that out there. It's not disappearing, but it's not going to be part of the Afterlife Conference anymore. What we're going to have instead is really interesting scholars from different perspectives. I've got people, this is all for a year from now, who grew up in very hardcore, high demand religions like Pentecostal, Jehovah's Witnesses, talking about their journey of healing. I've got scholars who, were Bible teachers and who know scripture in and out, talking about how they broke away from that and deconstructed their beliefs and reconstructed it into something else. I've got hardcore atheists who don't believe in anything that can't be proven by physical science, talking about their perspectives. So that's what it's going to be. I'm super excited about it. And I have started a new Facebook group, which you're all invited to join. It's simply called Death, Grief, and Belief. So sign up over there. Eventually, I'm going to merge these two groups together, my other Afterlife Facebook group and that one. But for now, please come and check out that other group.
And Terry, is your goal to kind of really challenge everyone's belief systems? I mean, because I've also have heard too from teachers that sometimes our own belief systems can keep us trapped in just one way of thinking. And if we can maybe, I don't know, walk around in the world and have limited beliefs, or maybe be open to not even having any beliefs, but hearing, like you said, like from all of these different people, what that does then to your own consciousness. I feel like it creates more of an expansion if we're not just hanging on to one belief system. So is that kind of the goal of what you're
exactly right? That's exactly right. And just the whole concept of belief itself is problematic because, like Brian said, it's binding. Yeah. Right? You're bonded to something. And so belief should be movable, and it doesn't mean that beliefs have to change, but you have to soften the edges. For example, I still believe in everything I believed in when I started the Afterlife Conference. Of course, I support mediumship and after-death communication and all that. It's just not my passion right now. My passions have moved, and the beliefs are kind of flexible because I've studied other cultures and other beliefs. I can tell you what I absolutely don't believe in. I don't believe that there's a God in the sky who punishes people and has an opinion about what we do and makes people burn in hell for eternity. So I suppose you could call that a belief. But then when you look at other cultures, they have some pretty rigid beliefs too. And the real thing that we're kind of pushing for is to soften the edges, to get away from the rigidity and orthodoxy. And there is orthodoxy even in spiritual but not religious or new age or whatever we want to call it. I mean, I've encountered so many people who absolutely believe in the law of attraction as described in the book The Secret. And they are so hardcore about it. And it's no different than having a belief in hell and punishment, because they have said to me, well, I did everything I was supposed to do. I envisioned myself, in a beautiful house with a beautiful husband and healthy. And I manifested and I said my affirmations and I shooed away all my negative thoughts and replaced them with positive thoughts, and all that doctrine, because that is doctrine. That the law of attraction teaches. So I did all that, but I'm still lonely and sick and poor. What did I do wrong? That is exactly the same as I went to church, I tithed, I prayed to Jesus, I did this and that, but my my child still died of leukemia. What did I do wrong?
Yeah.
Identical, same stuff. So what our goal really is to just open up those edges of orthodoxy a little bit and just let people be free to consider and to just, I haven't quite come up with the wording yet, but just, it's, let me say it another way. I spent 10 years in theology school. And what I say a lot now is the number one thing I learned from doing that is how to say, I don't know. And I get emails and Facebook posts from people all the time who think I'm some sort of expert on the afterlife. And they'll say, well, what do you think happens? Does this happen? What do our souls do? What do our dead people do? And my answer to them now is, I don't know. I know some things that I resonate with that feel true to me, but I'm not ever going to tell you the answer because I don't know. So that's new.
Yeah, definitely. And Terry, I was able to sit in and kind of watch a really interesting conversation with your sponsors this year, the Final Exit Network, and was wondering if you wanted to just talk a little bit about them sponsoring the conference and give them a little shout out, and what you've kind of like learned through that conversation with the person that you had spoke to during that interview.
Yeah. So the Final Exit Network used to be called the Hemlock Society. Some of you older folks, us older folks, will remember that. And they are an organization that educates you on how to take your own life. If you are terminally ill, if you live in unbearable pain, if your prognosis is, you're just going to suffer and go downhill, and there's no hope for recovery or getting back to a normal life, you can go through their program. They do some very serious screening to make sure that you meet very serious criteria. And they will not do it for you, not assist you, but will give you the instructions on how to leave your body and how to do it legally. And they do their best to involve your family and friends and create a support system. And I don't want to give too much detail because I'm not really qualified to explain what they do as well as they are. So watch the video. April, maybe you can post a link or something or let people know where they can find it. Or join our email list. Go to afterlifeconference.com, click on the subscribe button, and you will get a link to that interview.
Great. Yeah. It was just a really interesting conversation. We'll have that up on the Path 11 podcast, which is path11podcast.com. We also have some other podcasts of the presenters who are going to be, those shows are going to be out shortly. So you can head on over and download that podcast, and you can listen to some of the other presenters. I had the opportunity today to speak to Kitty Edwards, also Thomas John, and he really shared a lot of great personal stuff and actually his experiences of going to a medium after his dad had transitioned. So he really gave us a nice personal insight into his life with that. So those shows are going to be coming up too. Ryan, did you want to talk a little bit about your podcast? Because I know people are always looking for resources and different podcasts to listen to. So can you just tell people a little bit about where they can find your podcast, who you interview, the people that you have on, and what your show covers?
Sure, absolutely. And I guess I'll start off because I wanted to interject something about what Terry said earlier about belief and being a kid and growing up in the church under extremely toxic religion. I was told, believe, just believe, just believe, just believe. And so that's a trigger for me. I don't want to believe. And I think about I go back to religion because I was raised in the church. So when Jesus came to the disciples and the person we call Doubting Thomas said, is this really you? And Jesus said, put your hand in my side and touch my scars. It wasn't a matter of just believing. He really wanted to physically touch him. So what I try to do with people is like, I'm not asking you to believe anything. I'm a chemical engineer. I'm a skeptic by nature. And I want to define what a skeptic is. A skeptic is a person that is slow to draw conclusions. It doesn't mean that you're a cynic, that you don't believe anything. It just means you're slow to draw a conclusion. So I want to examine the evidence. What I try to do on Grief to Growth, and my podcast is Grief to Growth. It's Grief, the number 2, Growth. That's also my website. It's also the name of my book. is I give people reasons to believe. This is why I believe what I believe. Don't just take this on blind faith. There is so much scientific evidence out there. We talk about mediumship. There are people who have actually tested mediums. Dr. Gary Schwartz, who I happen to work with now, and one of the first books I ever read on the afterlife, he wrote a book called The Afterlife Experiments, where he sat down, he put mediums through multiple blind studies. Julie Beischel has done the same thing. And I have friends who are skeptics who have said to me, Brian, there's no evidence. And I'm like, where do you want to start? And how long have you got? And I've actually converted a couple of people. I had a friend that came to me. She said, I'm a hardcore skeptic. This is what I do for a living. I don't believe any of this stuff. Tell me the best medium you know, and I'm going to set up a blind reading with her. I'm going to prove to myself this isn't real. And she called me back after reading. She goes, it's real. It's the real deal. And she just told me just a couple of weeks ago, this has been a couple of years this happened. She said, I can't believe when I was a skeptic that I said there was no evidence for this. Now I see mountains and mountains of evidence. Why don't people know this? And it's just because in our society, we just say it can't be real. It's all woo-woo. And so I interview people like Dr. Bernardo Castro, who he's got 2 PhDs, one in computer science and one in philosophy. And he's written books like Why Materialism is Baloney. So, Terry was talking earlier about atheists. You might call me an atheist. I don't believe in a God in the sky either, but I'm not a materialist. And there's a difference between an atheist and a materialist. A materialist is one that believes that the only thing that exists is what we can see, touch, and feel. But we know that's not true because we know there's consciousness, and no one knows how to define consciousness. No one knows what it is. We can't put it in a test tube, but we know it's there. So what I call, when people talk about the supernatural, I'm like, there is no supernatural. There's only the natural. The supernatural is what we don't understand yet. And so that's what I try to do on my podcast. I bring on people that have gone through great trauma because I want to encourage people. If you've gone through this, other people have, and you can make it. But I also bring on people that have been to the other side. For example, near-death experiencers, mediums, people like Dr. Kastrup. I've had Terry on my podcast. People that can convince us that what we believe is real is really real. So that's what I try to put out for people.
And I would say, rather than what we believe is real, I would say what we feel is real, because I think that our resonance with these things comes more from the heart than the mind. So it's more of like, you feel it. It feels real. Believe is such a weird.
It's both. The thing is the heart, I've always said this, even when I was coming out of religion, it's got to be the heart first and then the mind. You can never talk anybody out of religion. They've got to say, this isn't working for me. And then they'll examine the evidence. It's the same thing. I think, as C.S. Lewis said, this desire for fairness, this desire for eternity is built into us. It's in all of us. We fear death. Why? Why do we fear not existing? Why is that? I think it's because we are actually eternal beings. And so then we start to seek, and then the evidence can start to seep in. And I slipped up and I used the word belief there, but I tell people, I believe that there's an afterlife, like I believe the sun's going to rise tomorrow. Mm-hmm. I don't know it, but I'm pretty sure it's going to happen.
That's language is always such a problem. And one of the things I would like to see happen in this community is to find new language for things. Mm-hmm. So, like belief, and I love that you brought up atheist versus materialist, because that's a huge difference. I joined an atheist group on Facebook recently because I just really wanted to research where they are. And I asked the question, can an atheist have a mystical experience? And about 60% of them said, absolutely not. There's no such thing as a mystical experience. And so that's, they're like, there's nothing, there's just, if you're dreaming, if you're having a dream, it's because your brain, or you can have mystical experiences on good drugs. That's pretty much what they all said. Yeah. And a few of them said, yeah, of course an atheist can have a mystical experience, because all atheism means is that you don't believe in a God figure.
Right.
But it doesn't discount the rest of the non-physical universe. So there's a big question, a big debate there. And, we just don't have the words to describe this. I'm really fond of the term spiritual, but not religious. That works well for me. And it's a well-known acronym now, SBNR. So if I had to identify myself with that, that would be my choice.
Yeah. So we actually have a question from somebody that is watching, Maureen, and I'm not sure if either of you have an opinion on this, but her question is, how can you be sure that a medium is really talking with your deceased loved one as opposed to picking up on their essence or residue, so to speak, or just reading your own mind and that's how they know what you did yesterday? She says she's so stuck on this. So do either of you, I mean, none of us are professional practice mediums per se, but anybody have
That's
any thoughts
a
about
good
this?
Brian question, but I want to say something about it first. A medium isn't going to tell you what you did yesterday. A psychic will do that. Oh, yesterday I see you took your dog to the vet. I may be wrong, Brian, but
But there are mediums that claim to
psychic
be
ability.
psychic mediums. So there's psychic
Yeah.
ability plus their mediumship.
All mediums are psychics. Not all psychics are mediums.
There
And
you
the
go.
difference is a psychic picks up on spiritual energy. A medium actually speaks with the quote dead people that are on the other side that are discarnate. And I have medium friends who debate this heavily. And I'll see one medium watching another medium and criticizing them, saying they just went psychic. There's and for me, I'm like, either way, you're connecting with the consciousnesses outside of your body. So it's pretty phenomenal either way. So to answer Maureen's question, there's no way that we can know for sure. And Terry, you made the point. Well, a medium will never tell you what you did yesterday. They may be, well, maybe they won't, because that's a psychic thing, but they can still tell you that. And I did have a medium tell me what my wife had for lunch the day before, and I didn't even know it. That was pretty impressive. But she also told me things that that came from my daughter. So Maureen, to answer your question is, yes, some mediums will say that, well, they just went psychic and they're connecting with you or they're connecting with your loved ones. And there are some people, frankly, who think they're mediums and they're not. They're only picking up, and this is, I've gotten this from medium friends, they're only picking up on things from you. And I don't say that to put doubt in anybody's mind, because frankly, if they can tell you what's going on in your mind, that also proves that consciousness is not local, that somehow they're able to pick up on that. And if they can do that, then certainly someone can pick up on a consciousness that has actually left the body. So it's a pretty technical question. It gets pretty complicated. A psychic might tell you, I had a friend that went to a psychic when he was young and said, you're going to be married 3 times. You're going to have 2 children that are not your own. And then 20 years later, that came to pass. And that's not mediumship, but it's still pretty impressive.
So I think it is important to divide mediumship and psychic. I've had that same experience, Brian, at the Afterlife conference when a medium was reading the room and I was sitting next to another medium. And the one I was sitting next to was just like poo-pooing him, saying, oh, that he's just picking up on what people are thinking. And I said to her, so what? I mean, that's pretty impressive. So, but it's like, if you're sitting there thinking about your dead mother and the necklace she gave you, you're in that audience with 400 people and you're thinking about the necklace, you're wearing the necklace that your mother gave you. And the medium says, your mother gave you a necklace and you're wearing it now. We don't know if the mother told him that or if they're just reading your mind because you're thinking about that.
And I just want to interject, there's no way to control that in that setting. When I read Gary Schwartz's research on mediumship, he actually did control for that, because the medium and the sitter never interacted. So he had like a technician interact with the sitter, and then another technician interacted with the medium, and the medium didn't even know who the target was. So you can control for that, and and Julie Beischel has done the same type of work, because her background is, I believe it was pharmacological research. So they know how to blind things. So we can know that mediumship is real. Now, again, frankly, going to any one particular medium, we have no way of knowing, because if they can read your mind and they can read the mind of the person on the other side, there's really no way of knowing. But you can know that you can prove to yourself without a doubt that your consciousness exists outside your body by some of the things that they tell you.
Yeah, great point, Brian. Well, I just want to thank you both so much. I know that our time is coming to an end, and I'd like everyone to know that we're actually going to do a couple more Facebook Lives on Friday, next week and the week after, right before the conference. We're going to be bringing some other guests on, some other presenters, and you'll get a chance to hear Terry and I talk, and would love for you guys to join us, join in on the conversation, bring your questions, put them in the comments. Again, the Afterlife Awareness Conference is going on June 24th through the 27th. Tickets can be purchased at afterlifeconference.com. You're going to see a lot of choices. There's a general admission ticket, but then there's also pre-workshops and post-workshops. So there's a lot to be offered here. Definitely check it out. I think that we provided you guys some really good stuff in this conversation today. And Terry, just wanted to thank you again. And Brian, it was great to have you on as a guest presenter here to join this conversation. So anybody have any last minute words? Terry, anything else that you'd like to say as we begin to wrap this up?
Just thank you, April, and thank you, Brian. I love talking to both of you. We have such great conversations. This was an awesome conversation. It was so much fun.
It was.
So thank you, everybody, and thank you for everybody who's listening on Facebook.
Yes, thank you. And take care, everyone. And be sure to follow our page, join the Afterlife conference newsletter from Terry's website there. And I hope you get a chance to listen to Brian's podcast as well, Grief to Growth. And check out the links that we have in the comments there. And we will see you guys next Friday on Facebook Live. Take care, everyone.